The winter wind howled through the broken shutters of the small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, carrying with it the bitter cold that seemed to seep into Emma Harrison's very bones. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stirred the meager pot of thin soup that would have to last her and her 2 young children through another day. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, highlighting the patches where her late husband Thomas had tried to seal the gaps against the harsh Dakota Territory winters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 26, Emma carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to bear more than her share of burdens. Her auburn hair, once lustrous and carefully braided, now hung in simple plaits that spoke of function over beauty. The calico dress she wore had been mended so many times that the original pattern was barely visible beneath layers of patches and careful stitching. Yet despite the poverty that had become her constant companion since Thomas's death 6 months ago, there remained something unbroken in her green eyes, a spark of determination that even the cruelest circumstances had failed to extinguish. The sound of her children's laughter drifted from the small back room where 8-year-old Lucy and 5-year-old Ben played with corn-husk dolls that Emma had fashioned from their last harvest. The innocent joy in their voices was both a blessing and a heartbreak, reminding her daily of what she was fighting to preserve and how precarious their situation had become. Thomas had been everything to this small family, provider, protector, and the steady hand that had guided them through the challenges of frontier life. Outside, the town of Cedar Falls went about its evening routines, but Emma had learned not to expect kindness from her neighbors. The attitudes toward her had shifted dramatically after Thomas's funeral, when it became clear that she intended to remain on their small homestead rather than return east to her family. A woman alone, with children, was seen as either a burden or a threat, and Emma had discovered that most of the townspeople viewed her as both. The troubles had begun innocently enough, with Mayor Franklin Pierce suggesting that Emma might be more comfortable returning to her family in Ohio. When she politely declined, explaining that the homestead was all she had left of Thomas and their dreams together, the suggestions became more pointed. Reverend William Crawford had visited twice, speaking in concerned tones about the impropriety of a young widow living alone on the frontier, away from proper Christian supervision and guidance. Emma had listened patiently to their concerns, understanding that frontier communities operated on unwritten rules about respectability and social order. But she had also made it clear that she had no intention of abandoning the land that Thomas had died defending. He had been killed during a Lakota raid 3 miles from their cabin, struck down while trying to protect their neighbors' livestock. The irony was not lost on Emma that the very people who praised Thomas as a hero now seemed to view his widow as an inconvenience to be managed or removed. The first real warning came when her credit was abruptly cut off at Morrison's general store. Helen Morrison, who had been cordial if not friendly since Emma's arrival in Cedar Falls 2 years earlier, suddenly became cold and businesslike. "Cash only for the Harrison account," she announced when Emma tried to purchase flour and salt with the promise of payment after her next small harvest. Emma had stared at the woman in confusion, her arm still holding Lucy's hand while Ben clung to her skirts. "Mrs. Morrison, I've always paid my debts. Thomas and I never left an account outstanding." Helen Morrison's expression had been carefully neutral, but her words carried an unmistakable message. "Times change, Emma. A woman alone can't be expected to manage financial obligations the way a man would. It's nothing personal, just good business sense." The humiliation of that moment had burned in Emma's chest as she led her children from the store empty-handed. She understood the message clearly enough. Without a man's name and earning power behind her, she was no longer considered a reliable member of the community's economic fabric. Her word, her character, and her past reliability meant nothing compared to the simple fact of her gender and marital status. That evening, as Emma sat mending Lucy's torn dress by candlelight, she had tried to explain to her children why they couldn't buy the candy sticks they had been promised. Lucy, wise beyond her years, had simply nodded and hugged her mother tighter. Ben, still too young to fully understand, had asked when Papa was coming home to make everything better. The question had nearly broken Emma's heart, but it had also strengthened her resolve. Thomas wasn't coming home, but she would find a way to make things better. She had to, for their sake, and for the memory of the man who had believed that a family could build a good life on the frontier through hard work and determination. The next blow came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Samuel Hayes, who had attended Thomas's final hours and delivered both her children, suddenly refused to extend credit for medical care. When Lucy developed a fever that lasted 3 days, Emma had carried her daughter through the muddy streets to the doctor's office, only to be turned away at the door. "I'm sorry, Emma," Dr. Hayes had said, though his expression suggested more discomfort than genuine regret. "I've been advised that extending credit to your household is no longer appropriate. Cash payment is required for all services." Emma had stood in the doorway, holding her feverish daughter, feeling the weight of the town's collective judgment settling around her like a suffocating blanket. "Dr. Hayes, Lucy is burning with fever." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Surely her health is more important than payment policies. The doctor had glanced nervously over Emma's shoulder, as if checking to see who might be watching their interaction. "There are other considerations, Emma. The community has concerns about your situation, your ability to provide properly for these children. Perhaps it would be better if they were placed with families better equipped to care for them." The suggestion had hit Emma like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to drive her away anymore. They were threatening to take her children, the only family she had left, the only reason she had for continuing to fight. Lucy had whimpered against Emma's shoulder, and the sound had filled Emma with a fierce protective rage that surprised her with its intensity. "My children stay with me," she had said quietly, but with such conviction that Dr. Hayes had stepped back involuntarily. "I'll find another way to care for Lucy's fever." Emma had spent that night applying cool cloths to Lucy's forehead and brewing teas from herbs she remembered her grandmother using. The fever had broken by morning, but the message from the town's leadership had been received clearly. They wanted her gone, and they were willing to use her children's welfare as leverage to achieve that goal. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. Emma's small garden, which had provided most of their food during the growing season, was vandalized twice in 1 week. Someone had trampled her bean plants and pulled up her potato vines, destroying months of careful cultivation. She had replanted what she could, but the growing season was too far advanced to recover fully from the damage. When Emma reported the vandalism to Sheriff Robert Mitchell, he had listened with the patience of a man fulfilling a duty rather than seeking justice. "Hard to say who might have done such a thing," he had mused, making notes in a small ledger that Emma suspected would never be referenced again. Could have been wild animals. Could have been children playing pranks. Frontier life is unpredictable. Emma had stared at the sheriff, a man who had shared meals in her home when Thomas was alive, who had bounced Lucy on his knee and praised Ben's attempts at whistling. Sheriff Mitchell, those potato plants were pulled up by their roots and arranged in a pile. Animals don't behave that way, and children don't typically destroy food that families depend on for survival. Sheriff Mitchell had closed his ledger with a soft snap. Emma, you're a fine woman, but you're seeing conspiracies where there might just be misfortune. Maybe it's time to consider whether this life is really suitable for a woman in your position." The dismissal had been polite but absolute. Emma realized that the law, like commerce and medicine, was no longer available to her as a source of protection or justice. She was being systematically isolated from every support system that frontier communities normally provided to their members. The message was clear: conform to their expectations or face the consequences alone. The breaking point came on a cold October morning when Emma discovered that someone had poisoned her milk cow, the animal that provided the dairy products essential to her children's nutrition. Bessie lay dead in the small pasture behind their cabin, her body showing clear signs of having consumed something toxic. Emma knelt beside the animal that had been both livestock and companion, feeling tears of rage and desperation burning behind her eyes. Lucy found her there an hour later, still kneeling beside Bessie's still form. Her daughter's small hand touched Emma's shoulder with the gentle understanding that children develop when they've witnessed too much adult sorrow. "Mama, what happened to Bessie?" Emma wiped her eyes and turned to face her daughter. "Someone wanted to hurt our family, sweetheart, but we're going to find a way through this." The loss of Bessie meant more than just the end of fresh milk and butter. The cow had represented security, a renewable resource that could sustain them through difficult times. Without her, Emma's options for feeding her children became drastically limited. She had no money to purchase another animal and no credit to acquire one through normal trading relationships. That afternoon, Emma walked into town with a heavy heart and desperate purpose. She needed to find work, any work, that would provide enough income to replace what they had lost. Her first stop was the Cedar Falls Hotel, where she hoped her experience managing a household might translate into employment in the kitchen or cleaning rooms. Margaret Foster, the hotel owner's wife, listened to Emma's request with the kind of polite attention that barely concealed impatience. "Emma, I sympathize with your situation, truly I do. But employing a woman in your circumstances would send the wrong message to our guests. People come to Cedar Falls expecting to find a respectable, well-ordered community." Emma felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she pressed forward. "Mrs. Foster, I'm a hard worker with excellent references. Thomas and I ran our household efficiently, and I've helped with church suppers and community events. My circumstances don't change my capabilities." "Deem." Margaret Foster's expression grew uncomfortable, as if Emma's persistence was forcing her to acknowledge truths she preferred to avoid. "It's not about your capabilities, dear. It's about appearances and community standards. A widow with children, working outside the home, living alone on the frontier, it raises questions about propriety and moral influence." The rejection stung, but Emma tried 2 more businesses before accepting that her reputation as an unsuitable woman had preceded her throughout the town. The bank, the dry goods store, even the stable owner, all found polite reasons why they couldn't offer employment to Thomas Harrison's widow. As Emma walked home through streets where she had once felt welcomed, she noticed how conversations stopped when she approached, how women pulled their children closer when she passed, how men touched their hat brims in greeting but avoided meeting. Her eyes. She had become something dangerous in their minds, a reminder that frontier life could strip away everything that made existence secure and predictable. That evening, as Emma heated water for baths and helped her children prepare for bed, she made a decision that both terrified and liberated her. She would not submit to the town's pressure to leave. She would not abandon the home that Thomas had built with his own hands, or surrender the dreams they had shared for their family's future. If Cedar Falls wanted to treat her as an outcast, she would learn to survive as one. The next morning brought visitors that Emma had not expected. Mayor Pierce arrived with Reverend Crawford and Dr. Hayes, their expressions grave with the weight of official business. Emma invited them into her small parlor, offering coffee she could barely afford, while maintaining the courtesies that frontier hospitality demanded. Mayor Pierce spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his suggestions followed. "Emma, we've come to discuss your situation and the community's concerns about your welfare and that of your children." Emma sat straight in her chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "I appreciate your concern, Mayor Pierce. My children and I are managing quite well, considering our circumstances." Reverend Crawford leaned forward with the earnest expression he used when delivering difficult sermons. "Emma, my dear child, pride is a sin that can blind us to practical realities. The community has resources available to help you and the children, but only if you're willing to accept guidance and make reasonable decisions about your future." The words were carefully chosen, but Emma understood the ultimatum beneath their charitable packaging. "What kind of guidance are you suggesting, Reverend?" Dr. Hayes consulted a small notebook before answering. "There are families back east who would be honored to provide homes for Lucy and Ben, good Christian families with the means to ensure proper education and moral development. As for you, there are opportunities for employment in larger cities where a woman's situation would be less complicated." Emma felt the room grow cold around her, despite the fire crackling in the small hearth. They were asking her to give up everything, her children, her home, her independence, her connection to Thomas's memory. In return, they offered her the chance to become invisible, to disappear into anonymous employment where her inconvenient existence wouldn't challenge their ideas about how frontier communities should function. "Gentlemen," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling beneath the surface, "I appreciate your concern for my family's welfare. But my children belong with me, and our home is here, on the land that my husband died defending." Sir Mayor Pierce's expression hardened slightly. "Emma, you're not thinking clearly about what's best for those children. A woman alone cannot provide the stability and guidance that growing youngsters require. The community has a responsibility to intervene when children's welfare is at stake." The threat was no longer veiled in charitable language. Emma understood that they were prepared to use legal means to separate her from Lucy and Ben if she continued to resist their pressure. The realization filled her with a cold rage that burned more fiercely than any emotion she had ever experienced. "My children are healthy, well-fed, and properly cared for," Emma replied, rising from her chair with dignity that made all three men shift uncomfortably. "If the community wishes to help our family, there are ways to do so that don't require destroying what we've built together." Reverend Crawford's voice took on the tone he used for particularly stubborn sinners. "Emma, your stubbornness is placing innocent children at risk. Winter is coming. You have no reliable source of income, and your isolation from community support makes your situation increasingly desperate." Emma walked to the window that looked out over the small homestead that Thomas had carved from the wilderness. The fields were brown now with autumn's approach, but she could still see the potential that had drawn them to this place. She could imagine spring plantings and summer harvests, could envision Lucy and Ben growing up with the strength and independence that frontier life developed in children who were raised with love and purpose. "Gentlemen," she said without turning from the window, "I understand your concerns, but my decision remains unchanged. My children and I will stay together, and we will remain on our land." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats and disappointed expectations. When Emma finally turned back to face her visitors, their expressions had hardened into the resolved looks of men who had tried reason and found it insufficient. Mayor Pierce stood first, his official bearing emphasizing the authority behind his words. "Emma, the community cannot continue to support your decision to place children at risk through stubborn pride. If you will not accept reasonable assistance, other measures may become necessary." The warning hung in the air long after the three men had departed, leaving Emma alone with the knowledge that her battle for independence had entered a new and more dangerous phase. As she watched their buggy disappear down the dusty road toward town, Emma realized that her situation had moved beyond social pressure and economic isolation. She was now facing the possibility of legal action that could destroy her family permanently. That evening, as Emma tucked her children into the beds that Thomas had built with careful attention to their small sizes, she made a silent promise. To the memory of her husband and to the future she was determined to protect. Whatever came next, she would not surrender without a fight that honored everything they had built together and everything she hoped to preserve for Lucy and Ben. The wind continued to howl around their small cabin, but inside, Emma Harrison sat by the dying fire and planned for a battle she couldn't afford to lose. The first snow of winter arrived 3 days after the mayor's visit, blanketing Cedar Falls in a deceptive beauty that masked the harsh realities Emma knew lay ahead. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the white flakes drift past while calculating how long their remaining supplies might last. The root cellar held perhaps 2 weeks' worth of preserved vegetables, and the small bag of flour she had managed to purchase with her last few coins would barely stretch through the month if she was careful. Lucy pressed against her mother's side, her small face serious as she observed the falling snow. "Mama, will we have enough firewood to stay warm?" Emma smoothed her daughter's hair with gentle fingers, marveling at how perceptive children became when circumstances forced them to understand adult concerns too early. "We'll manage, sweetheart. Your papa cut a good supply before he died, and I've been gathering fallen branches from the woods." What Emma didn't tell Lucy was that their woodpile was already smaller than it should have been for winter's approach. Someone had been stealing wood during the night, taking just enough each time to avoid immediate notice, but leaving them dangerously short of the fuel they would need to survive the brutal Dakota winters. Emma had considered staying awake to catch the thieves, but she knew that confronting them would likely lead to worse problems. The harassment had intensified since the mayor's ultimatum, taking forms both petty and serious. Emma's small flock of chickens had been scattered twice, with several birds disappearing entirely. The henhouse door had been left open during a rainstorm, soaking the feed and making it unusable. Someone had dumped dirt into her well, forcing Emma to spend 2 back-breaking days cleaning it out and praying the water source hadn't been permanently contaminated. Most disturbing were the signs that people had been watching their cabin during the night. Emma had found footprints around the windows and discovered that someone had tried to peer through the gaps in their shutters. The knowledge that strangers were observing her family's private moments filled Emma with a violation that went beyond mere intimidation. It was psychological warfare designed to make her feel unsafe in her own home. Ben had begun having nightmares, waking in the middle of the night, crying for his father and asking why people were angry with them. Emma would hold him close, singing the lullabies that Thomas had taught her, trying to provide comfort while battling her own growing fears about their situation. The stress was affecting all of them, but she was determined not to let her children see how desperate things had become. Emma's attempts to find work continued to meet with rejection, but the reasons were becoming more creative and insulting. When she offered to take in laundry, Martha Peterson claimed that a woman in Emma's situation might not maintain proper hygiene standards. When Emma suggested she could teach children to read, as she had helped several neighborhood youngsters. Before Thomas's death, Reverend Crawford worried aloud about the moral influence of a woman who defied community guidance. The most painful rejection came from Sarah Brennan, who had been Emma's closest friend since their arrival in Cedar Falls. Sarah's husband owned the largest ranch in the area, and Emma had hoped that their friendship might transcend the social pressure being applied by the town leadership. She had walked the 3 miles to the Brennan Ranch on a cold morning, carrying Lucy and Ben despite the distance, hoping to find both work and understanding. Sarah had greeted them at the door with obvious discomfort, her usual warm smile replaced by nervous politeness. "Emma, what brings you out here in this weather?" Emma had explained her situation directly, asking if there might be work available at the ranch kitchen or helping with the household management during the busy winter months. Sarah had listened with growing distress, glancing frequently toward the barn where her husband worked with the ranch hands. "Emma, you know I care about you and the children," Sarah had said carefully, "but Patrick has made it clear that we can't be seen supporting your decision to stay here. The ranch depends on good relationships with the townspeople, and taking you on would send the wrong message about our position on family values." The words had stung more than any direct insult could have. Emma understood that Sarah was choosing economic security over friendship, but the betrayal still cut deeply. She had bundled the children back into their heavy coats and made the long walk home in silence, feeling more isolated than ever from the community that had once welcomed her. Family! That evening, as Emma heated stones by the fire to warm their beds, she overheard Lucy whispering to Ben about the strange looks people gave them in town. Her 8-year-old daughter was trying to explain to her little brother why their friends' mothers no longer allowed play dates and why shopkeepers watched them suspiciously when they entered stores. The conversation broke Emma's heart and strengthened her resolve simultaneously. Her children were learning lessons about injustice and community cruelty that no child should have to understand. But they were also seeing their mother refuse to surrender in the face of overwhelming pressure, and Emma hoped that example would serve them well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The weather grew colder as October faded into November, bringing with it new forms of harassment that seemed calculated to test Emma's endurance. Someone began leaving dead animals on her doorstep, rotting carcasses that attracted scavengers, and filled the air around their cabin with the stench of decay. Emma would rise each morning to find rabbits, squirrels, or birds arranged prominently where her children would be sure to see them. The psychological impact was carefully planned. Ben began refusing to go outside to play, afraid of what gruesome discoveries might await him. Lucy developed a nervous habit of checking corners and shadows, her childhood innocence gradually being replaced by the wariness of someone who had learned that the world could be deliberately cruel. Emma disposed of each dead animal with grim determination, burying them far from the cabin and scrubbing the doorstep clean before her children could fully process what they had seen. She refused to let the harassment achieve its intended effect of driving them away through fear and disgust, but the constant stress was wearing on all of them. The situation escalated when Emma discovered that someone had been tampering with their food supplies. A sack of cornmeal that should have lasted 2 weeks was found contaminated with dirt and mouse droppings. Preserved meat that Emma had carefully prepared for winter storage showed signs of deliberate spoilage. Someone with access to their root cellar was systematically destroying the resources they needed to survive. Emma realized that the harassment had moved beyond intimidation into direct sabotage of their survival capabilities. The message was clear: submit to the community's demands or face the possibility of starving during the winter months. The escalation filled Emma with cold fury, but also with a growing sense of desperation about their options. When Emma confronted Sheriff Mitchell about the increasing severity of the harassment, his response revealed how completely she had been isolated from any possibility of official protection. He listened to her complaints with the patience of a man fulfilling a duty he considered pointless, making notes in his ledger without any apparent intention of investigating. "Emma, you're describing a lot of unfortunate coincidences," he said when she finished recounting the dead animals, contaminated food, and stolen firewood. "Frontier life is hard, especially for someone trying to manage alone. Maybe these problems are just signs that you're taking on more than one person can handle." Emma stared at the sheriff, a man who had eaten at her table and praised her cooking, who had complimented Thomas on his choice of wife and congratulated them on their children's births. "Sheriff Mitchell, you know these aren't coincidences. Someone is deliberately trying to force my family off our land." Sheriff Mitchell closed his ledger and leaned back in his chair, his expression mixing sympathy with resignation. "Even if that were true, Emma, what would you have me do? Arrest half the town based on suspicions? Post guards around your cabin? I've got responsibilities to the entire community, not just to one family that's chosen to ignore good advice." The dismissal was complete and final. Emma understood that the law, which should have protected her family's rights and safety, had been compromised by the same social pressure that had closed off every other avenue of support. She was truly on her own, facing enemies who felt justified in their actions and protected by the community's collective approval. Walking home from town that day, Emma noticed how conversations stopped when she passed, how women pulled their skirts aside as if her presence might contaminate them, how children stared at Lucy and Ben with the curious hostility that young people quickly learned from their parents. Her family had become pariahs in a community that had once welcomed them as valuable additions to the frontier settlement. The psychological isolation was perhaps worse than the physical harassment. Emma found herself second-guessing every decision, wondering if her stubborn resistance to community pressure was really in her children's best interests. During the long nights when wind rattled their shutters and unknown footsteps crunched through the snow around their cabin, she questioned whether pride was worth the suffering her defiance was causing Lucy and Ben. But each morning brought renewed determination as Emma watched her children adapt to their circumstances with the resilience that had drawn her and Thomas to frontier life in the first place. Lucy had learned to help with household tasks that would have been considered too advanced for her age, and Ben was developing the self-reliance that frontier families valued above formal education. They were becoming stronger through adversity, even as they were being traumatized by the community's cruelty. The breaking point came on a bitter November morning when Emma discovered that someone had poisoned their remaining chickens. The birds lay scattered around the henhouse, their bodies twisted in death poses that spoke of deliberate murder rather than natural causes or predation. Emma knelt among the dead animals, feeling the last of her economic resources disappearing into the frozen ground. Lucy found her there, surrounded by the carnage that represented the end of their egg supply and the loss of their only renewable source of protein. Her daughter's face showed a maturity that 8-year-olds should never have to develop, an understanding that their situation had moved beyond the reach of adult solutions. "Mama, are they trying to make us starve?" Lucy asked with the directness that children used when they sensed that polite euphemisms would no longer protect them from harsh realities. Emma looked into her daughter's eyes and saw her own determination reflected there, mixed with a trust that Emma would find a way to protect their family no matter what obstacles emerged. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it also clarified her thinking in a way that weeks of doubt and self-questioning had not achieved. "They're trying to make us leave, sweetheart," Emma said honestly, gathering Lucy into her arms while surveying the destruction around them. "But we're not going anywhere. This is our home, and we're going to find a way to keep it." That afternoon, Emma made a decision that terrified and liberated her simultaneously. She would no longer try to work within the community's expectations or seek approval from people who had already judged her unworthy of basic human decency. If Cedar Falls wanted to treat her as an outcast, she would learn to survive as one, using resources and methods that respectable townspeople would never consider. Emma had noticed tracks in the snow around their property that didn't belong to the people harassing them. Larger prints, made by moccasins rather than boots, suggesting that Native Americans were aware of her family's situation. The knowledge should have frightened her, given the stories that circulated about Indian raids and frontier violence, but Emma found herself wondering if the people who were supposedly her enemies might offer more honest treatment than the community that claimed to represent Christian civilization. The thought was radical and dangerous, challenging everything Emma had been taught about frontier safety and social order. But as she buried the last of their poisoned chickens and calculated how little food remained for the winter months ahead, Emma began to consider possibilities that desperation made seem less impossible. That evening, as she tucked her children into beds, warmed by heated stones, and told them stories about brave pioneers who overcame impossible odds, Emma made a silent decision that would have shocked the townspeople who were working so hard to drive her away. If the community of Cedar Falls would not accept her family as worthy members, she would seek acceptance elsewhere, even if that meant crossing boundaries that frontier society considered absolute and unchangeable. The wind continued to howl around their small cabin, but Emma no longer felt entirely alone in her struggle. Somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded their homestead, there were people who lived by different rules and judged worthiness by different standards. Whether they would prove to be friends or enemies remained to be discovered, but Emma was ready to find out. As she sat by the dying fire, mending clothes by candlelight and planning for survival through sheer determination, Emma Harrison prepared to take steps that would either save her family or destroy them completely. The safe path of submission and surrender was no longer an option she could consider. Everything depended on her willingness to risk everything for the chance of building a life on her own terms. The harassment escalated further as December approached, bringing with it storms that isolated the Harrison homestead from any possibility of outside help. Emma woke one morning to find their water pump frozen solid, not from natural cold, but from someone having poured water over the mechanism during the night. The sabotage would force her to melt snow for drinking water, a time-consuming process that would strain their already limited fuel supplies. More disturbing was the discovery of carved symbols on trees around their property, markings that Emma didn't recognize, but that seemed deliberately placed to send a message. When she asked Dr. Hayes about the symbols during a chance encounter in town, his reaction was telling. He had glanced at her description nervously before suggesting that she might be seeing patterns where none existed, but his discomfort suggested that he knew exactly what the markings meant. Emma began to suspect that the harassment campaign was more organized than she had initially realized. The timing of various incidents, the escalating severity, and the coordination required suggested that someone was directing the pressure rather than letting it develop spontaneously. The realization that her family was the target of a deliberate conspiracy made their situation feel even more hopeless. Ben's behavior began showing signs of serious stress as the harassment continued. He started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was 3 years old. He would cling to Emma's skirts when they went outside, constantly checking over his shoulder for threats that might emerge from the shadows. The confident little boy who had once explored their property fearlessly was becoming anxious and withdrawn. Lucy responded differently, developing a fierce protectiveness toward her mother and brother that sometimes worried Emma with its intensity. She had fashioned weapons from kitchen utensils and sticks, practicing movements she imagined might be useful if someone tried to hurt their family. Her daughter's warrior spirit was admirable, But Emma grieved for the childhood innocence that circumstances were forcing Lucy to abandon. The physical toll of constant stress was affecting Emma as well. She had lost weight that she couldn't afford to lose, and the strain of maintaining vigilance against multiple forms of harassment was exhausting her reserves of strength and optimism. There were moments when the idea of surrendering seemed almost attractive, when the thought of ending the struggle held appeal despite everything she would lose. But those moments of weakness were always followed by renewed determination as Emma watched her children adapt to their circumstances with courage that inspired her own resistance. They were learning lessons about standing up to injustice and maintaining dignity under pressure that would serve them throughout their lives. Emma refused to teach them that survival required surrendering their principles or accepting defeat when they knew they were right. The final escalation came on a night when the wind was howling so fiercely that Emma almost missed the sounds of multiple people moving around their cabin. She lay awake listening to footsteps, voices, and the unmistakable sounds of deliberate destruction taking place outside their walls. When morning came, she discovered that someone had demolished the small shed where Thomas had stored his tools, scattering the implements across their yard and breaking several pieces that would be impossible to replace. More seriously, the intruders had attempted to set fire to their woodpile, succeeding in destroying about a third of their winter fuel supply before the snow and wind prevented the flames from spreading. Emma stood among the charred remains of wood that represented warmth and survival, understanding that the harassment had crossed into territory that threatened their lives directly rather than simply making them uncomfortable. The message was unmistakable: submit immediately or face the possibility of freezing to death before spring arrived. Emma gathered the scattered tools with grim determination, knowing that her enemies had revealed the extent of their commitment to driving her away. They were willing to risk her children's lives to achieve their goals, crossing moral boundaries that Emma had hoped even her harshest critics would respect. That realization changed everything for Emma, clarifying her thinking and strengthening her resolve in ways that months of lesser harassment had not achieved. If the people of Cedar Falls were willing to threaten her children's survival, then conventional rules of social behavior no longer applied to their conflict. Emma was free to consider options that desperate circumstances made necessary, even if those options challenged everything she had been taught about proper frontier conduct. As she surveyed the damage and calculated their remaining resources, Emma Harrison prepared to take steps that would either lead to salvation or destruction. The middle ground of gradual submission was no longer available, if it ever had been. Everything now depended on her willingness to risk everything for the chance of protecting what mattered most. The December storm that trapped Emma and her children in their cabin for 5 days proved to be both a blessing and a curse. The howling winds and blinding snow prevented any further harassment from the townspeople, giving the family a brief respite from the constant pressure that had defined their lives for months. But the storm also revealed just how precarious their situation had become as their carefully rationed supplies dwindled to almost nothing, and the damaged woodpile barely provided enough fuel to keep them from freezing. On the storm's final night, Emma sat wrapped in Thomas's old coat, watching the last few pieces of wood burn in their fireplace, while her children slept fitfully in the single bed they now shared for warmth. The silence outside was profound after days of wind, and in that stillness Emma heard something that made her heart race with both hope and terror. Voices carried on the cold air, speaking in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. Was not the harsh English of her tormentors. Moving carefully to avoid waking Lucy and Ben, Emma crept to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. In the moonlight reflecting off fresh snow, she could see figures moving with purposeful grace across the landscape around her homestead. They were dressed in winter clothing that seemed to blend with the environment rather than fight against it. and they moved with the quiet confidence of people who belonged in this harsh wilderness. Emma's first instinct was fear, conditioned by years of frontier stories about savage raids and violent encounters with native tribes. But as she watched the figures examining the destroyed shed and the burned woodpile, their movements suggested investigation rather than preparation for attack. They were studying the evidence of harassment with what appeared to be professional interest, and one of them was making marks in a small book that caught the moonlight. The realization that she was being observed by people who might understand her situation from a completely different perspective filled Emma with an unexpected sense of possibility. These were individuals who lived outside the social structure that had rejected her family, people who might judge worthiness by different standards than those applied by the citizens of Cedar Falls. When morning came, Emma found evidence that her nighttime visitors had left gifts rather than threats. A bundle of properly seasoned firewood had been stacked near their door, enough to last several days if used carefully. Beside it lay fresh meat wrapped in materials she didn't recognize, gleaned and prepared with obvious skill. Most surprisingly, there was a collection of winter plants and roots that Emma's grandmother had taught her to recognize as valuable for both nutrition and medicine. Lucy discovered the gifts first, running to fetch Emma with excitement that quickly turned to confusion. "Mama, where did these things come from? Did someone from town finally decide to help us?" Emma knelt beside the carefully arranged supplies, running her fingers over materials that spoke of generosity from unexpected sources. The meat was venison, professionally butchered and still fresh despite the cold. The firewood was seasoned, hardwood that would burn clean and hot, far superior to the green branches she had been collecting from the forest floor. The plants showed knowledge of winter survival that few white settlers possessed. "I think we have friends we didn't know about, sweetheart," Emma said carefully, unsure how to explain the situation to her 8-year-old daughter. "People who understand what we're going through and want to help." Ben joined them at the door, his 5-year-old eyes wide with wonder at the mysterious bounty that had appeared overnight. "Are they magic people, Mama? Like in the stories Papa used to tell?" Emma smiled at her son's innocent interpretation, remembering Thomas's tales of forest spirits and guardian angels who helped travelers in distress. "Maybe they are, Ben. Or maybe they're just good people who believe in helping families that need assistance." The gifts represented more than physical resources, though Emma was grateful for every piece of wood and every ounce of meat. They represented hope that her family was not as isolated as the townspeople wanted them to believe. Somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded Cedar Falls, there were people who had witnessed the harassment and chosen to respond with kindness rather than judgment. Emma spent that day teaching her children to prepare the unfamiliar plants, sharing knowledge that her grandmother had passed down about frontier survival and the wisdom of indigenous peoples. Lucy proved particularly apt at learning which roots could be boiled for nutrition and which leaves might help with Ben's persistent cough. The lessons connected them to survival traditions that preceded the arrival of European settlers, knowledge that the established community would have dismissed as primitive superstition. That evening, as they enjoyed their first substantial meal in weeks, Emma made a decision that would have shocked the respectable citizens of Cedar Falls. She prepared her own gift in return, selecting items that might be valuable to people living in harmony with the wilderness rather than trying to dominate it. She gathered needle and thread, buttons and a small mirror, things that might be useful to people who had mastered survival but might appreciate the conveniences of civilization. Emma left her offering in the same location where she had found the morning's gifts, along with a note written in her careful script. "Thank you for your kindness to my family. We are strangers to your ways but grateful for your generosity. Emma, Harrison, and children." She weighted the paper with a stone, and hoped that whoever had helped them would understand her attempt at communication. The exchange continued for several days, with Emma's family receiving supplies that revealed increasingly sophisticated knowledge of their specific needs. Someone had observed that Ben's cough was worsening and provided herbs that eased his breathing. Within hours of preparation, when Lucy mentioned that she missed having books to read, a collection of hand-drawn stories appeared, illustrated with pictures that told tales without requiring shared language. Most remarkably, their unknown benefactors began leaving toys and games that delighted the children and provided entertainment during the long winter evenings. Carved animals, simple puzzles, and counting games that taught mathematical concepts through play rather than formal instruction. Ben's nightmares began to fade as he played with toys that seemed designed specifically for his age and interests. Emma found herself looking forward to these mysterious exchanges with anticipation that surprised her. After months of hostility and rejection from people she had considered neighbors and friends, the anonymous kindness felt like a lifeline to humanity and compassion. She began leaving longer notes, sharing details about her children's interests and her own struggles with winter isolation. The response came in the form of practical advice written in careful English on materials that were clearly handmade. Cover windows with extra cloth during coldest nights. Boil pine needles for tea rich in health medicine. Children learn faster when teaching includes stories and songs. The suggestions revealed understanding of both frontier survival and child development that impressed Emma with their thoughtfulness. Emma realized that her mysterious correspondents possessed knowledge that combined the best aspects of native wisdom and European education. Their advice was practical and effective, but it was presented with consideration for her family's emotional needs as well as their physical survival. These were people who understood that children required more than basic sustenance to thrive. During difficult circumstances, the relationship deepened when Emma began receiving suggestions for defending her family against the ongoing harassment. Spread ash around property boundaries, plant thorns near windows, store water inside during cold nights to prevent tampering. The advice was strategic and defensive rather than aggressive, suggesting people who understood conflict but preferred to avoid unnecessary violence. Emma implemented the suggestions carefully, explaining to Lucy and Ben that they were learning new ways to protect their home that other frontier families might not know. The children embraced the activities as interesting games rather than desperate security measures, maintaining their resilience while contributing to their family's safety. The defensive preparations proved their value when Emma's tormentors returned after the storm. The ash around their property boundaries revealed multiple sets of footprints, showing exactly where intruders had approached their cabin and what they had attempted to accomplish. The thorn barriers prevented access to windows, forcing would-be saboteurs to remain at distances where their activities were more easily detected. Most importantly, the indoor water storage prevented another attempt to freeze their pump, ensuring that Emma's family maintained access to clean drinking water despite the continued harassment. The practical knowledge shared by their unknown allies was proving more effective than any protection the official authorities had been willing to provide. Emma's confidence grew as she discovered that survival was possible even under siege conditions, provided one possessed the right knowledge and received assistance from people who understood frontier realities. Her children were learning skills that would serve them throughout their lives, developing self-reliance and adaptability that formal education rarely provided. The turning point came when Emma received a message that was different from the practical advice and supplies that had sustained them through the worst weeks of winter. Written on fine paper in elegant script, the communication was both invitation and warning. Danger approaches soon. Trust the storm wind when it brings help. Prepare children for journey to safety. Your courage has been witnessed and honored." Emma read the message multiple times, understanding that their situation was about to change dramatically. Someone with knowledge of the townspeople's plans was warning her that the harassment would escalate beyond anything they had yet experienced. But the message also promised help, suggesting that allies were prepared to take active steps to protect her family. That evening, Emma explained to Lucy and Ben that they might need to leave their cabin quickly, and they should prepare small bundles of their most important possessions. She presented the preparation as an adventure game, but her children had learned to read the serious undertones in adult conversations. They packed their few treasures with the solemnity of people who understood that their lives might depend on being ready to move without warning. The storm arrived 2 days later, bringing with it winds that howled with supernatural force and snow that obliterated all visibility beyond a few feet. Emma had experienced many Dakota blizzards, but this one felt different, charged with energy that made the air itself seem alive with possibility and danger. On the storm's second night, Emma was awakened by sounds that were clearly human, but unlike anything she had heard during previous harassment episodes, these were voices raised in anger and fear, shouting commands and warnings that suggested conflict rather than coordinated intimidation. Through the wind and snow, she could hear the crash of breaking wood and the unmistakable sounds of violence. Emma gathered her children into the safest corner of their cabin, wrapping them in blankets while trying to understand what was happening outside their walls. The sounds suggested that multiple groups were engaged in some kind of confrontation, with their homesteads serving as either the focus or the battlefield for a conflict larger than the personal harassment they had endured. The cacophony reached a crescendo and then suddenly stopped, leaving only the wind and snow to fill the silence. Emma waited for what felt like hours, listening for any indication of who might have won whatever battle had taken place in the darkness. Around their home, her children dozed fitfully against her shoulders while she maintained vigilant watch. Dawn brought revelation that transformed Emma's understanding of her situation entirely. The snow around their cabin was trampled and disturbed, showing evidence of significant conflict. But more importantly, there were bodies scattered across their yard, frozen forms that Emma recognized as some of the men who had been leading the harassment campaign against her family. Mayor Pierce lay crumpled near their woodpile, his expensive coat torn and his face bearing the expression of someone who had died in shock and terror. Dr. Hayes was sprawled near the shed, his medical bag scattered and its contents mixed with snow that was stained red with blood. 3 other men Emma didn't recognize lay in positions that suggested they had died while fleeing rather than fighting. The implications were staggering. Someone had intervened to protect Emma's family using methods that the civilized townspeople of Cedar Falls would never have considered necessary or appropriate. The harassment campaign had been ended permanently through violence that was swift, decisive, and apparently executed by people who possessed superior knowledge of winter warfare. Emma should have been horrified by the carnage surrounding her home, but instead she felt a profound relief that the constant threat to her children had been eliminated. Whoever had acted on their behalf understood that some situations required solutions that polite society would condemn, but frontier reality sometimes demanded. As Emma stood among the bodies of her tormentors, she realized that her family's survival had been purchased through alliance with people who operated by different rules than those taught in churches and schools. The knowledge should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with gratitude and curiosity about the allies who had chosen to protect them. The sound of approaching horses made Emma gather her children and retreat into their cabin, uncertain whether the newcomers represented friend or foe. Through the window, she watched as a group of riders emerged from the forest, moving with the same purposeful grace she had observed in her nighttime visitors. They were Native Americans, dressed in winter clothing that spoke of practical adaptation to harsh conditions rather than ceremonial display. The leader dismounted near their door, a tall man whose bearing suggested both authority and confidence. His hair was black with silver streaks that spoke of maturity and experience, and his features were marked by intelligence and what Emma somehow recognized as kindness, despite the circumstances that had brought him to her homestead. He approached their door with respectful caution, stopping at a distance that would allow Emma to observe him without feeling threatened. When he spoke, his English was clear and educated, carrying an accent that marked him as someone who had learned the language rather than being born to it. "Mrs. Harrison, I am Standing Bear of the Lakota people. I have come to speak with you about your family's safety and future. May I approach your door?" Emma felt her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for since her mysterious allies had first begun helping them survive the winter. The formal introduction and respectful approach suggested diplomatic intention rather than aggressive conquest. "You may approach," Emma called through the door, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I am grateful for your people's kindness to my family during our difficulties." Standing Bear moved closer, stopping just outside their threshold. "Your courage has been observed and honored, Mrs. Harrison. You have shown strength in protecting your children against enemies who used cowardice and cruelty as weapons. Such bravery deserves respect and protection." The words were spoken with formal gravity that suggested they carried significance beyond simple compliment. Emma understood that she was being evaluated according to standards she didn't fully comprehend, but her instincts told her that this evaluation was more fair and honest than any judgment she had received from the people of Cedar Falls. "My children and I are grateful for all assistance your people have provided," Emma replied, choosing her words carefully. "We have learned much about survival and kindness from unexpected teachers." Standing Bear's expression showed approval of her response. "Winter brings many lessons for those wise enough to learn them. Your family has proven worthy of instruction and protection. Now comes the time for more difficult choices." Emma felt the weight of momentous decisions settling around her, like the snow that continued to fall steadily outside. Whatever Standing Bear proposed would change their lives forever, taking them far from anything resembling the conventional frontier existence she had struggled to maintain. "What choices do you speak of?" Emma asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Standing Bear gestured toward the bodies scattered around their homestead. "Your enemies will be missed, and their people will seek vengeance. This place is no longer safe for you or your children. You must choose between attempting to explain these deaths to authorities who will not believe your innocence, or accepting protection from people who understand justice differently than your former community." The choice was stark and immediate. Emma could try to convince the remaining townspeople that she had no part in the deaths of their leaders, knowing that they would almost certainly refuse to believe her innocence, or she could trust her family's safety to people who had already demonstrated their willingness to protect innocent families against injustice. Looking at her children, who were watching the conversation with solemn attention, Emma realized that the decision had already been made weeks ago when she first began accepting help from her mysterious allies. She had crossed into territory that the respectable citizens of Cedar Falls would never understand or forgive. "What protection do you offer?" Emma asked, meeting Standing Bear's gaze directly. His answer would change everything for the Harrison family, transforming them from desperate outcasts into something entirely new and unprecedented in the cultural landscape of the Dakota Territory. Standing Bear's proposal came with a gravity that Emma recognized as both honor and profound responsibility. Among my people, there exists a sacred tradition of protection for those who have shown courage in the face of impossible odds. You have proven yourself worthy of such consideration, Emma Harrison. I offer you and your children the protection of marriage alliance, not born of romance, but of respect and mutual benefit. Emma felt the weight of his words settling around her like a ceremonial robe, beautiful but heavy with obligations she didn't fully understand. Through the cabin window, she could see other Lakota warriors maintaining respectful distance, while their leader conducted what was clearly a formal negotiation rather than a casual conversation. These were people who understood protocol and ceremony, whose culture included traditions for situations that white society had never encountered. I don't understand what such a marriage would mean, Emma said honestly, gathering Lucy and Ben closer to her side. My children and I know nothing of your people's ways, and I fear we would bring more burden than benefit to your community. Standing Bear's expression showed patient understanding rather than impatience with her questions. Knowledge can be learned by those with wisdom and willing hearts. Your children have already shown they can adapt to new teachings, and you have demonstrated strength that my people value above formal education. The sacred wife tradition exists specifically for situations where conventional marriage would be inappropriate, but protection and alliance are necessary for survival. Emma looked into the faces of her children, seeing Lucy's serious concentration, as she tried to follow the adult conversation, and Ben's wide-eyed fascination with the tall man, whose presence seemed to command respect from the very air around him. They had been living as outcasts for months, learning that the society they had been born into offered them no place and no protection. Perhaps it was time to discover whether a different society might welcome their contributions. What would be expected of me as a sacred wife? Emma asked, needing to understand the full scope of what Standing Bear proposed before she could make a decision that would affect her children's entire future. Standing Bear gestured toward the snow-covered landscape that stretched beyond their small homestead, toward horizons that seemed to promise infinite possibility. You would be welcomed into our winter camp as a woman of honor, protected by the tribe's strength and bound by its customs. Your children would be raised as Lakota, learning our language and traditions while maintaining connection to their father's heritage. You would contribute your skills and knowledge to the community's welfare, as all adults must do. The explanation was practical rather than romantic, outlining a relationship based on mutual benefit and shared responsibility rather than emotional attachment. Emma understood that Standing Bear was offering her family a place in a society that functioned according to different principles than those she had known, where worth was measured by contribution and character rather than by adherence to arbitrary social conventions. And what would you gain from such an arrangement? Emma asked, recognizing that successful alliances required benefit for both parties rather than one-sided charity. Standing Bear's smile showed appreciation for her practical approach to what could have been an overwhelming emotional decision. Your courage would strengthen our people's resolve, showing that survival and dignity are possible even when faced with seemingly impossible odds. Your children would grow up understanding both cultures, becoming bridges between peoples who have often viewed each other as enemies. Your knowledge of white customs and language would be valuable as our people navigate increasing contact with settlements. Emma realized that Standing Bear was proposing something far more complex than simple rescue or refuge. He was suggesting a genuine alliance that would transform both her family and his community, creating something new from the combination of different strengths and perspectives. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, offering possibilities. that she had never imagined during her years of conventional frontier life. Lucy tugged at Emma's sleeve, her young voice carrying the clarity that children brought to complicated adult decisions. "Mama, would we be safe with these people? Would they teach us things like the gifts they've been leaving?" Emma looked down at her daughter, remembering how Lucy had flourished when learning to identify and prepare the medicinal plants their mysterious allies had provided. Her children had been starving not just for food, but for knowledge and skills that their isolated existence could never provide. Perhaps Standing Bear's proposal offered them the education and community that conventional society had denied them. "Mr. Standing Bear," Emma said formally, recognizing that her response would be remembered and repeated according to whatever diplomatic protocols governed such negotiations. "I need to understand what would happen to my children if something were to happen to me. In white society, orphaned children often face terrible hardships. How would your people treat them if they lost their mother's protection?" Standing Bear's expression grew solemn with the weight of promises that would extend beyond his own lifetime. "Children who are accepted into our tribe become children of the entire community. They would be raised with love and guidance from many adults, learning skills and values that would prepare them for whatever challenges life might bring. Your Lucy and Ben would never lack for protection or opportunity to develop their abilities." Emma felt something inside her chest loosening, a knot of anxiety that had been tightening since Thomas's death, finally beginning to relax. For months, she had carried the terrible burden of knowing that her death would leave her children completely defenseless in a society that had already demonstrated its willingness to harm them. Standing Bear's promise offered them security that extended beyond her own ability to provide protection. "There is one more consideration," Standing Bear continued, his voice taking on the formal cadence that Emma was learning to recognize as significant among his people. "The sacred wife tradition includes spiritual elements that bind the families together permanently. If you accept this alliance, your children will be considered Lakota regardless of their birth heritage. They will carry that identity throughout their lives, with all the obligations and benefits such belonging provides." Emma understood that Standing Bear was describing a transformation that would be permanent and complete, changing not just their immediate circumstances, but their fundamental identity within the complex social structures of the frontier. Her children would grow up as members of a culture that white society viewed as primitive and dangerous, but which had demonstrated more genuine kindness and practical wisdom than the supposedly civilized community that had rejected them. The decision required careful consideration of consequences that would extend far beyond their immediate survival needs. Emma asked for time to speak privately with her children, and Standing Bear withdrew to a respectful distance while she explained the situation in terms that Lucy and Ben could understand. "The man outside is offering to make us part of his family," Emma told them, sitting cross-legged on their cabin floor while winter wind rattled the shutters around them. "It would mean leaving this house and learning to live very differently than we have before. You would learn new languages and new skills, but you would also be safe and cared for by people who have already shown us great kindness." Lucy's response showed the maturity that hardship had forced upon her young shoulders. "Mama, the people in town have been trying to hurt us for a long time. These new people have been helping us and keeping us safe. I think we should trust the people who help instead of the people who hurt." Ben's contribution was simpler but equally decisive. "Will there be other children to play with? And will the nice people keep bringing us presents and teaching us games?" Emma smiled at her son's priorities, recognizing that his emotional needs were as important as the practical considerations that occupied her adult thinking. "I believe there will be children for you to play with, and many people who will be happy to teach you new things." The conversation that followed revealed how thoroughly her children had absorbed the lessons of their recent experiences. They understood that conventional safety was an illusion, that the people who claimed to represent respectability and Christian values had proven themselves capable of cruelty and injustice. They were ready to place their trust in people who had demonstrated kindness through actions rather than words. When Emma called Standing Bear back to continue their discussion, she found herself speaking with confidence that surprised her. "My children and I have talked, and we understand that your offer represents both opportunity and obligation. We are willing to accept your protection and to contribute whatever skills and knowledge we possess to your community's welfare." Standing Bear's expression showed satisfaction mixed with something deeper that Emma would later learn to recognize as spiritual recognition. "Your acceptance honors both our peoples. The ceremony will take place when we reach the winter camp, witnessed by the elders who maintain our traditions and oversee such alliances." Emma felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as she realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't fully predict or control. What happens now? How do we prepare for such a journey in winter conditions? Standing Bear gestured toward his warriors, who began approaching the cabin with purposeful organization. "My people are skilled in winter travel and have prepared for your family's needs. We will take only what cannot be replaced, leaving the rest for spring recovery if circumstances permit return." The next few hours passed in a blur of efficient activity as the Lakota warriors helped Emma pack the possessions that would be essential for her family's transition to their new life. She was impressed by their knowledge of what items would be valuable in their community and what could be safely abandoned. They showed particular interest in her sewing supplies, Thomas's tools, and the books she had been reading to her children. Emma found herself making rapid decisions about which memories to preserve and which to leave behind. The quilt her grandmother had made carried too much sentimental value to abandon, but the heavy furniture that Thomas had crafted would be impossible to transport during winter travel. Each choice represented a step away from her previous identity and toward an unknown future. Lucy and Ben treated the packing process as an adventure, fascinated by the equipment and methods the Lakota warriors used for winter transportation. They watched with wide eyes as travois were assembled and loaded with scientific precision that ensured optimal weight distribution and protection from weather. Ben was particularly entranced by the dogs that would help pull their belongings, animals that seemed trained for specialized work rather than simple companionship. As afternoon faded into evening, Emma found herself standing in the cabin doorway, looking back at the home where she had shared her happiest memories with Thomas and where her children had learned their first lessons about frontier life. The small rooms held echoes of laughter and love that would be impossible to pack and carry to their new existence. Standing Bear approached her with respectful understanding of the emotional weight such departures carried. Leaving places of memory is always difficult, but carrying those memories in your heart allows them to strengthen you wherever your path may lead. Emma nodded, wiping away tears that she had been fighting since the packing began. "Thomas and I built this place with dreams of raising our children in safety and community. It's hard to accept that those dreams require abandoning everything we work to create." Standing Bear's response carried wisdom that spoke of experience with loss and transformation. Dreams change shape, but need not die completely. Your children will grow strong and capable, carrying forward the best of what their father gave them while learning new skills that will serve them in whatever world they encounter. Zo. The words offered comfort without minimizing the magnitude of what Emma was sacrificing. She understood that Standing Bear's people had their own experience with forced displacement and cultural adaptation, making them particularly qualified To understand the emotional complexity of her decision, as darkness fell, Emma made her final preparations for departure, including writing a letter that she left on the cabin table for anyone who might eventually discover their empty home. The letter explained her decision in terms that she hoped would prevent wild speculation about her family's fate, while protecting the people who had offered them sanctuary. "To whoever finds this letter," Emma wrote in her careful script, "my children and I have left Cedar Falls voluntarily to seek safety and opportunity elsewhere. We are grateful for the kindness some people showed us, and we forgive those who felt unable to offer assistance during our difficulties. May God bless this territory and guide all who seek to build good lives here. Emma Harrison and children." The letter was both truth and protection, acknowledging their departure without revealing details that might endanger their new allies. Emma sealed it with wax from a candle that Thomas had made during their first winter together, feeling the symbolic weight of closing one chapter of her life and beginning another. Standing Bear's warriors had prepared sleeping arrangements that would allow them to rest comfortably despite the winter cold, using techniques and materials that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cold weather survival. Emma and her children were given warm robes and shown how to position themselves for optimal heat retention during the night's travel. "We move during darkness to avoid observation by those who might attempt to follow," Standing Bear explained, as they made final preparations for departure. "Travel will be easier for your family if they can sleep during the most difficult portions of the journey." Emma appreciated the practical consideration for her children's comfort and safety. Lucy and Ben were exhausted by the day's emotional intensity and physical activity, falling asleep quickly once they were settled into the traveling arrangements. Watching them rest peacefully despite their strange surroundings, Emma felt confident that her children possessed the adaptability necessary for their dramatic change in circumstances. The journey began in moonlight that turned the snow-covered landscape into a dreamlike scene of silver beauty. Emma rode alongside Standing Bear, while her children slept in carefully constructed carriers that protected them from wind and cold. The rhythmic movement of travel and the soft sounds of winter night gradually calmed her anxiety about the unknown future they were approaching. Standing Bear proved to be a thoughtful traveling companion, answering Emma's questions about Lakota customs and social structure, while sharing stories that helped her understand the complex history of his people's relationship with white settlers. She learned that his English education had come from missionary schools, but that he had chosen to return to his traditional community rather than assimilating completely into white society. "Many of our young people face the choice between old ways and new," Standing Bear explained as they traveled through a forest where snow-laden branches created natural shelters along their route. "I learned that wisdom comes from understanding both paths rather than rejecting either completely. Your family's presence will help our children see that cooperation between peoples is possible without requiring anyone to abandon their heritage." Emma began to understand that her acceptance into the Lakota community represented something larger than personal rescue. Standing Bear's people were navigating the same cultural challenges that had overwhelmed her own situation, seeking ways to preserve their identity while adapting to changing circumstances. Her family's integration would serve as an experiment in cross-cultural cooperation that could benefit both communities. As the night progressed, Emma found herself sharing stories about her own background and the experiences that had shaped her understanding of frontier life. Standing Bear listened with the respectful attention that she was learning to recognize as characteristic of his people's approach to communication. He asked thoughtful questions that helped her articulate ideas she had never previously expressed about community, family, and the meaning of belonging. The conversation revealed that both of them had experienced the isolation that came from challenging conventional expectations, about appropriate behavior and social roles. Standing Bear's decision to blend traditional leadership with formal education had created tensions within his own community, just as Emma's refusal to abandon her independence had put her at odds with the citizens of Cedar Falls. Perhaps that is why the spirits guided us to find each other, Standing Bear suggested as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. Those who have learned to bridge different worlds can help others find such paths for themselves. Emma felt the truth in his words, resonating with her own sense that their meeting represented more than coincidence or simple rescue. The challenges that had driven her family from Cedar Falls had also prepared them for opportunities that conventional frontier existence would never have provided. Her children would grow up understanding multiple perspectives on survival, community, and the meaning of courage, as the sun rose fully, revealing a landscape that was both beautiful and vast. Beyond anything Emma had previously experienced, she realized that her old life had truly ended, and something entirely new was beginning. The mountains in the distance promised adventures and challenges that would test everything she thought she knew about herself and her capabilities. Standing Bear called a halt near a sheltered grove where they could rest during the day's heat and prepare for the final portion of their journey to the winter camp. Emma's children awakened, refreshed and excited by their first experience of travel with the Dakota expedition, chattering about the dogs and sleds while examining their new surroundings with the fearless curiosity that characterized childhood. "Are we almost to our new home, Mama?" Lucy asked, her young face bright with anticipation rather than anxiety. Emma looked toward the distant mountains where Standing Bear had indicated their destination lay hidden among valleys that white. Maps had never accurately recorded. "Almost, sweetheart. Soon we'll meet the people who will be our new family." The word family carried different meaning now than it had during their conventional frontier existence. Emma was beginning to understand that the Lakota concept of kinship extended far beyond blood relationships to include spiritual connections and mutual obligations that created security through community bonds rather than individual accumulation of resources. As they prepared to complete their journey toward a future that would challenge and transform all of them, Emma Harrison felt a peace that had been absent from her life since Thomas's death. Whatever lay ahead would be faced with courage, strengthened by alliance rather than born alone through stubborn determination. Her children would learn to be bridges between worlds, carrying forward the best of their heritage while embracing new possibilities for what family and community could become. The Lakota winter camp emerged from the valley mists like a vision from another world, its organized beauty challenging every preconception Emma had carried about Indian settlements. Dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns created neighborhoods that spoke of sophisticated social organization, while smoke rising from cooking fires suggested prosperity and community warmth that Emma's isolated homestead had never achieved. Standing Bear rode beside Emma as they approached the camp's perimeter, his posture showing pride mixed with careful attention to her reactions. "This is Makoskan, the place where my people gather when the snows come heavy. You and your children will find welcome here, though the customs may seem strange at first." Emma felt her breath catch as she observed the bustling activity that characterized the camp's daily life. Women worked together on complex tasks that seemed to require multiple sets of skilled hands, their laughter carrying across the snow as they shared both labor and companionship. Children ran between the teepees in games that appeared to combine physical training with pure enjoyment, their voices bright with energy despite the winter cold. Lucy pressed closer to Emma's side, her 8-year-old eyes wide with fascination rather than fear. "Mama, look how many children there are, and see how the houses are shaped like triangles pointing at the sky. Ben bounced excitedly in his traveling carrier, pointing at everything that caught his attention. "Are those real horses, Mama? Look how pretty they are with all those decorations." Emma smiled at her children's wonder, recognizing that their immediate acceptance of the camp's unfamiliar sights would make their transition easier than her own adult anxieties might allow. They possessed the adaptability that childhood provided, viewing difference as adventure rather than threat. Standing Bear guided them toward a large tipi that occupied a position of obvious importance within the camp's layout. "My grandmother waits to meet you. She is the keeper of our traditions and the one who will oversee your acceptance into our family circle." Emma felt nervousness flutter in her stomach as she realized that her future depended on gaining approval from someone whose standards and expectations remained completely unknown to her. Everything she understood about making good impressions was based on white social customs that might mean nothing in this cultural context. The elderly woman who emerged from the teepee moved with dignity that spoke of authority earned through decades of wisdom and service to her community. Her silver hair was braided with ornaments that caught the winter sunlight, and her dark eyes assessed Emma with intelligent curiosity rather than judgment. "Grandmother," Standing Bear said in English, clearly intending for Emma to understand. The introduction: "This is Emma Harrison and her children Lucy and Ben. They seek protection and belonging among our people." The grandmother's examination of Emma was thorough but not unkind, taking in everything from her practical clothing to the way she held her children close without allowing fear to show in her expression. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear, suggesting education that had been carefully preserved despite cultural pressures to abandon traditional knowledge. "I am Winona, grandmother to Standing Bear and keeper of our family's sacred responsibilities. Your courage in protecting your children has been observed and honored. Now we must see if your heart can learn the ways that will make you truly one of our people." Emma understood that she was being offered both welcome and challenge, acceptance conditional on her willingness to embrace transformation rather than simply seeking refuge. The test would be whether she could contribute meaningfully to the community rather than remaining an outsider dependent on their charity. "Grandmother Winona, I am honored by your welcome. My children and I bring willing hearts and whatever skills we possess. We hope to learn wisdom from your people while sharing what knowledge we have gained." Winona's smile showed approval of Emma's response, particularly her recognition that meaningful relationships required mutual exchange rather than one-sided assistance. "Wisdom grows when different experiences meet with respect. Come, let me show you the place that will be your home." The tipi that Winona led them to was smaller than Standing Bear's dwelling, but perfectly suited for a family of 3. Emma was amazed by its efficient design, providing warmth, privacy, and storage space within a structure that could be assembled or dismantled with remarkable speed. The furnishing spoke of craftsmanship that combined beauty with practical functionality. Lucy and Ben explored their new home with delight, discovering sleeping areas that seemed designed specifically for children and storage systems that turned organization into an engaging puzzle. Emma watched them adapt with the flexibility that had sustained them through months of hardship, their resilience once again proving stronger than circumstances. "Your children learn quickly," Winona observed, settling beside the central fire with the ease of someone completely comfortable in her environment. "This is good, for they must understand our ways before the spring ceremonies that will make their belonging permanent." Emma felt the weight of that timeline settling around her like a comfortable burden. She had the winter months to prove herself worthy of the alliance that Standing Bear had offered. Time to demonstrate that her family could contribute meaningfully to the community's welfare rather than simply consuming resources. The days that followed revealed the complexity and sophistication of Lakota social organization. Emma found herself assigned to work groups that rotated responsibilities according to skills and seasonal needs, ensuring that essential tasks were completed efficiently while providing opportunities for teaching and learning. Her sewing abilities proved immediately valuable, as winter clothing required constant maintenance and repair. More surprising was the community's interest in her literacy skills. Many of the younger Lakota had learned English through missionary contact, but few possessed the formal education that would allow them to navigate increasingly complex negotiations with government officials and territorial authorities. Emma's ability to read legal documents and write formal correspondence was recognized as a strategic asset. Lucy and Ben integrated into the camp's social structure with enthusiasm that sometimes exhausted Emma's ability to keep pace with their adventures. Lucy discovered a talent for beadwork that impressed the older women, while Ben's natural affinity for horses earned him attention from warriors who were happy to teach riding skills to an eager student. Standing Bear proved to be a patient teacher, as Emma learned the customs and protocols that governed daily life in the camp. Their relationship developed into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared responsibility for community welfare rather than the romantic attachment that white society might have expected from their marriage alliance. Among our people, Standing Bear explained during one of their evening conversations, marriage serves many purposes beyond individual happiness. It creates bonds between families, ensures protection for children, and strengthens the community through shared obligations and resources. Emma appreciated the practical approach to relationships that prioritized stability and mutual benefit over emotional drama. Her marriage to Thomas had been based on love, but it had also been a partnership dedicated to building something larger than either person could achieve alone. The sacred wife tradition offered similar opportunities for meaningful collaboration. The winter months passed with surprising speed as Emma mastered skills that transformed her understanding of survival and community cooperation. She learned to tan hides, preserve meat, and identify medicinal plants that grew in environments completely different from the prairie around Cedar Falls. More importantly, she learned to think in terms of collective welfare rather than individual accumulation. The Lakota approach to child rearing particularly impressed Emma with its combination of high expectations and gentle guidance. Lucy and Ben were expected to contribute meaningfully to household tasks while being supported through mistakes and encouraged to develop their unique talents. The result was confident children who understood both responsibility and belonging. Spring's arrival brought preparations for the ceremonies that would formalize Emma's family's integration into the tribe. The rituals were complex and beautiful, involving the entire community in celebrations that honored both tradition and adaptation. Emma found herself moved by the spiritual significance that her new people attached to life transitions and community bonds. The sacred wife ceremony took place during the first full moon after the spring equinox, witnessed by elders who had traveled from distant bands to participate in the unprecedented alliance. Emma wore clothing that had been crafted specifically for the occasion, decorated with symbols that told the story of her journey from isolation to belonging. Standing Bear's vows spoke of protection and mutual respect rather than romantic love, promising partnership in service to community welfare and shared responsibility for raising children who would bridge different worlds. Emma's response emphasized her commitment to learning and contributing while maintaining the best elements of her heritage. Lucy and Ben participated in their own adoption ceremonies, receiving Lakota names that honored their courage during the difficult months before their arrival at the winter camp. Lucy became Brave Heart Woman in recognition of her maturity and protective instincts, while Ben was named Swift Running Boy for his enthusiasm and natural athletic ability. The ceremonies concluded with feasting and storytelling that continued deep into the night, creating memories that would bind the community together through whatever challenges the future might bring. Emma felt herself surrounded by genuine warmth and acceptance that transcended cultural boundaries through shared recognition of fundamental human values. As summer approached, Emma's role in the community expanded to include responsibilities that utilized her unique background and skills. She became an interpreter and cultural liaison when trading parties encountered white settlements, helping to negotiate agreements that benefited both communities while avoiding the misunderstandings that had historically led to conflict. Her children flourished in their dual identity, becoming fluent in Lakota while maintaining their English literacy and connection to their father's heritage. Lucy showed particular aptitude for the diplomatic skills that would become increasingly important as contact between cultures intensified, while Ben developed into a skilled horseman whose abilities earned respect from warriors twice his age. Standing Bear's leadership of the band was strengthened by his alliance with Emma's family, demonstrating to both Lakota and white communities that cooperation was possible without requiring either culture to abandon its essential characteristics. Their success encouraged other cross-cultural alliances that gradually created networks of understanding across the territory. Emma's correspondence with former acquaintances in Cedar Falls revealed that her disappearance had become the subject of legend and speculation. Some stories portrayed her as a victim of savage kidnapping, while others suggested that she had chosen exile rather than conform to community expectations. Emma was content to let the mystery remain unsolved, protecting her new family from interference, while allowing her old community to draw whatever lessons they could from her example. Years passed with contentment that Emma had never experienced during her conventional frontier existence. Her children grew into confident young adults who moved easily between cultures while maintaining strong roots in both traditions. Lucy became a skilled negotiator whose abilities were sought by tribal councils and territorial authorities alike, while Ben earned recognition as both a warrior and a peacemaker. Standing Bear's prediction that Emma's family would serve as bridges between peoples proved prophetic, as their success encouraged other alliances and exchanges. The winter camp became a gathering place for individuals and families from various backgrounds who sought alternatives to the rigid social structures that characterized both traditional and settler communities. Emma's own transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story. The desperate widow, who had once faced starvation and exile, had become a respected leader whose wisdom was sought by both Lakota elders and white officials. Her ability to understand multiple perspectives while maintaining clear principles made her invaluable in negotiations that shaped the future of the entire region. When territorial historians eventually documented the period, Emma Harrison's story became a testament to the possibilities that emerged when courage and compassion transcended cultural boundaries. Her children's children would grow up in a world where cooperation between different peoples was accepted as natural rather than exceptional, largely because of the example set by families like theirs who chose bridge building over isolation. Standing Bear aged into a revered elder whose leadership was remembered for its wisdom in adapting traditional values to changing circumstances. His alliance with Emma demonstrated that strength could come from inclusion rather than exclusion, from building new traditions rather than rigidly defending old ones. Emma lived to see her grandchildren playing together in camps where multiple languages were spoken, and various customs were practiced with mutual respect. The desperate flight from Cedar Falls that had once seemed like the end of everything had become the beginning of possibilities that neither culture could have achieved alone. In her final years, Emma often reflected on the strange paths that life sometimes required for growth and fulfillment. The community that had rejected her family for failing to conform had ultimately freed them to discover forms of belonging that were richer and more meaningful than anything conventional society could have provided. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.